Hello everyone. Thank you all for watching the video. Wishing you all good health and peace. The dawn crept over the village like a thief, its light stealing through the mist that cloaked the hills, but Diep felt no warmth in its touch. She stood in a stranger's kitchen, her hands gripping a worn basket, empty now except for the ghosts of her past. The air was thick with the scent of dew and charcoal, woven with the distant hum of a waterfall hidden in the pines. Hockey, her little dog, pressed against her ankle, his eyes bright with unwavering trust, but even his presence couldn't heal the wound that had opened in her heart. Hours ago she'd been driven from her shack, her home of bamboo and memory, by the cold command of James's father. "You're not welcome here. Leave and don't look back." She set the basket down, its creak a quiet lament, and gazed at the unfamiliar yard, its dirt packed hard by lives she didn't know. The village stirred beyond, its rhythm a faint pulse, roosters crowing, smoke curling from thatched roofs, a child's laughter fading into the morning. But this wasn't her place, not the shack where she'd cooked rice with salt, where she'd sat with James under the tamarind tree, planning a life that seemed possible. She thought of the stream near her old home, its waters glinting like scattered coins, where James had held her hand and painted dreams. "These fields, Diep," he'd said, his voice steady as the earth, "they're ours. We'll build something here together." She believed him, her heart wide as the sky, thinking love could root deeper than the potatoes they planted. But now those dreams were ash, scattered by his father's will. Diep knelt by Hockey, her fingers tracing his fur, and whispered, "You're all I have left, aren't you?" His tail wagged, a small rebellion against her grief, and she clung to it, a flicker of light in the dark. She thought of her mother, gone these many years, who taught her to plant by the moon's phases, to husk corn with care, to carry on when the world grew heavy. "Your heart is your strength," her mother had said, her hands rough but tender, shelling peanuts under a banyan tree as dusk fell. Diep had been a girl then, her laughter free, thinking life was as simple as the earth beneath her feet. Now she wondered if her mother had known how sharp the world could cut, how love could lift you only to let you fall. Her mother's face rose in her mind, clear as the morning light, her eyes crinkled with warmth, her voice soft as she spoke of the land. They'd sat together once by the village well, sorting beans as the sun dipped low. "This earth," her mother had said, "it holds you deep. It doesn't care if you're poor or rich. It gives to those who tend it." Diep had nodded, her fingers stained with dust, believing life could be that generous. Now she saw the truth. Earth might give, but men like James's father took, their judgments heavier than any harvest. He'd looked through her, his voice cold. "You're poor, divorced. You'd shame my family." She'd fought to prove him wrong, faced him in a tea shop with a dress that cost her savings, but her words had fallen like seeds on stone. Yesterday had begun with hope, fragile but fierce. She'd woken to find James at her door, his face taut with worry, his voice breaking as he spoke of his father. "Why didn't you tell me?" he'd asked, and she'd confessed, her words halting, about the meeting she'd faced alone, the courage she'd drawn from books that preached resilience. "I wanted to fight for us," she'd said, and he'd pulled her close, his anger melting into a vow. "No more hiding," he'd said. "I've let my father control me too long, school, work, everything. But you, Diep, you're my choice. We'll face him together." They'd stood in her garden, picking kohlrabi and potatoes, their hands brushing as they laughed, and she'd believed they could win, that love was enough. They'd cooked that morning, stirring greens and eggs, their voices mingling with the sizzle of oil. She'd smiled, setting the table, and said, "These vegetables are sweeter because we grew them." He'd nodded, his hand warm on hers, and they'd prayed together, thanking God for the meal, their words a quiet defiance against the world. "Fight, don't run," he taught her, and she'd promised, her heart full, to stay by his side no matter what. But by dusk, his father's men had come, their voices flat. "You need to leave. Now." She'd packed in silence, her hands trembling as she gathered bowls, chopsticks, the primer she'd studied by lamplight. The shack had held her life, her mother's lessons, James's laughter, Hockey's warmth, and leaving it felt like tearing out her roots. The worker, a man with kind but weary eyes, had led her here, to this kitchen among women who lived quietly, their lives a mirror to her own. "Don't tell James," she begged, her voice small. "He's got projects, cassava flour, clean farms. I can't burden him." The man had hesitated, then nodded, and she'd watched him go, hockey at her side, the village fading into night. She'd wanted to protect James, to let him build his dreams, a better life for farmers, profits that dwarfed Rice's meager yield, but at what cost? Her heart bled, not just for him, but for the girl she'd been, the one who dared to love a man whose world was so far from hers. Diep stepped into the yard, the dirt cool under her feet, and looked out at the village. The hills loomed soft in the mist, their green a quiet promise she no longer trusted. She thought of her grandmother, who'd sat with her under the stars, telling stories of bamboo flutes carved from rice stalks, blown to call the rain when drought scorched the land. The gods listen, her grandmother had said, her eyes crinkling with faith, and as a child Diep had believed it, blowing tunes until her breath ran dry. They'd lain on a mat by the river, fireflies dancing, and her grandmother had traced constellations, naming them for dreamers who defied the odds. "You're one of them," she'd whispered, and Diep had carried that whisper through the years, a spark against the dark. Now it flickered, threatened by the weight of James's father's scorn. Her past rose unbidden, a shadow she couldn't shake. Years ago, her family, desperate, had sold her to a man she didn't know. A marriage that was no marriage but a chain, a debt paid with silent tears. It had ended, leaving her free but marked, a scar James's father had wielded like a weapon. "You were sold," he'd said, as if it defined her, but she'd refused to let it. She'd built her shack, planted her garden, found James, a man who saw her heart, not her poverty. Yesterday they'd harvested pumpkins, their hands stained with earth, and planned to sell them at the market. "We'll make something good," James had said, his voice bright with plans, dried cassava, clean vegetables, a future for the village. She'd nodded, her heart full, thinking she could be part of it. But James's father had seen no worth in her, only flaws. He'd controlled James's life, demanding top grades, a flawless career, a perfect bride, and when James chose her he'd struck back, casting her out. James had fought him once, he told her, fleeing to Vietnam to escape that grip. "I want to decide my own destiny," he'd said, his voice raw, and she'd believed him, believed they could defy the odds. They'd stood in her garden, laughing over misshapen potatoes, and he'd promised, "We'll fight for this, Diep. No one will tear us apart." But now she was gone, driven from her home, and James was left calling her name to an empty shack, his heart breaking as hers did. Diep wandered to the village's edge, where the fields stretched wide under the noon sun. She'd worked these lands with James, planting cabbage and kohlrabi, their sweat mingling with the soil. A woman named Huynh had shown her the rows, her voice steady. 30 million dong a hectare, better than Rice's 7. James had listened, his eyes bright with plans. Cassava flour, clean farms, a way to lift farmers from hardship. Diep had seen a future there, a way to grow beyond her shack, to prove she was more than his father claimed. She'd held a seed from Huynh's farm, small but heavy with possibility, and dreamed of planting it. A crop, a skill, a life. Now that seed was gone, left behind with her primer, her bowls, her hope. The market lay ahead, its stalls a patchwork of color under tamarind trees. She had nothing to sell, no pumpkins to weigh, but she lingered, drawn to its hum. Buyers moved like shadows, their voices soft, and she remembered her mother's laughter here, her hands quick with the scale, her smile a beacon in the bustle. "Sell with pride," she'd said, and Diep had tried, but pride was hard to hold when she'd been cast out. An old man, his face etched like tree bark, paused by her side. "No basket today, child?" he asked, his voice kind. Diep shook her head, her throat tight, and he pressed a guava into her hand, its skin warm. "For strength," he said, and walked on, leaving her with tears she couldn't shed. She thought of James, somewhere in the village, his heart shattering as he stood in her empty shack. She pictured him calling her name. "Diep, Diep, where are you?" His voice breaking as he saw the bowls gone, the chopsticks vanished, hockey missing. "You promised," he'd said yesterday, his eyes fierce with love. "No matter what, you'll stay by my side." She'd promised, her hand in his, but now she'd broken it, not by choice but by force, driven out by a man who saw her as nothing. Would James understand, or would he believe she'd betrayed him, as his cries had feared? 8 billion people, and her nowhere to be found? She didn't know, and the not knowing was a wound that bled with every breath. Diep sat by the stream that cut through the valley, its waters glinting under the sun, a ribbon of light against the earth. Haki curled beside her, his warmth a fleeting balm. She let her fingers trail in the current, its chill grounding her thoughts. Her past was a shadow, but her love for James was a fire, burning despite the ashes. She'd learned from him, fight, don't run, try 1% more each day, and from books that spoke of strength. But strength had limits, and she'd reached hers, driven from her home, her dreams scattered like seeds in a storm. She spoke to the stream, her voice barely audible. Poverty isn't a sin, is it, Haki? I chose him, but did I lose him? The village carried on, its people woven into her days. She thought of the worker who'd helped her, his eyes kind but powerless, offering this kitchen where women lived quietly, their lives a mirror to her own. She thought of Hwin's farm, the pumpkin fields, James's plans to dry flour, to build a future for farmers. He'd spoken of profits, of cabbage outpacing rice, but she'd heard his heart, his need to do good. She'd wanted to stand beside him, to plant more than crops, to grow a life. Now she was rootless, her future a question mark, her love a promise she couldn't keep. Dusk settled, painting the hills in shades of gold and shadow. Diep returned to the kitchen, Haki at her heels, the guava still warm in her palm. The air carried the scent of wood smoke and dew, wrapping her in a fleeting peace. The kitchen was bare, its walls cold, but she lit a candle, its flame dancing like a memory. She sliced the guava, its juice sweet against her fingers, and fed a piece to Haki, his eyes bright with trust. She thought of her mother's stories, of women who'd loved against the odds, who'd faced scorn and stood tall. The heart knows its own path, her mother had said, and Diep wanted to believe it, wanted to trust that her love for James could endure. But James's cries echoed in her mind, Diep, where are you? She pictured him in her shack, the emptiness a betrayal he couldn't understand. He'd promised to fight, to defy his father, who'd chained him to a life of perfection. Top student, flawless CEO, ideal bride. James had rebelled once, choosing her, but now he thought she'd left him, broken her word in a world too vast to cross. Would he search for her, or would his father's will pull him back, tearing them apart? She didn't know, and the not knowing was a wound deeper than her own. She spoke to Haki, her voice soft. You won't leave me, will you? You're my only friend now. Sleep came fitfully, broken by the creak of the kitchen's walls and Haki's soft whines. In her dreams she saw James's father, his eyes cold, standing at the edge of the fields, his words a chant. You're not enough. She reached for James, but he was gone, leaving only the sound of water rushing over stones, endless and cold. She woke to dawn's first light, her body weary but her resolve flickering, a small flame that refused to die. She rose, fed Haki, and stepped outside, the village stirring under a sky heavy with clouds. The path stretched ahead, unfamiliar but steady, winding through hills that held both her past and her future. She thought of James, of his vow to fight, of his despair when he found her gone. Would he defy his father, search the world for her, or believe she'd betrayed him as his cries had feared? She thought of her shack, her garden, the life she'd left behind, and of this kitchen, a fragile shelter against the storm. Today she'd walk to the market, nod to strangers and carry on, her heart a quiet drumbeat against the morning's song. But in that heart, a question lingered, soft as moonlight, sharp as stone. Would their love survive the distance, the doubt, the weight of a world that pulled them apart? The answer wasn't here, not yet. It lay somewhere beyond the fields, beyond the hills, in a moment she couldn't yet see. For now Diep walked on, her steps steady, her soul a flickering flame that burned against the dawn.